Trump's message is simple. Canada is a free rider, and the US is footing the bill. That's the claim that President Donald Trump has been making in early 2025, accusing Canada of relying too much on American military protection while failing to invest in its own defense. And according to Trump, that needs to change fast. But is he right? Does Canada really depend on the US to keep it safe, or is there more to the story? And if Canada is a military free rider, what does that mean for its future relationship with the US? In this video, we'll break down Trump's argument, examine the facts behind it, and explore whether Canada is truly coasting on America's military might, or if it's pulling more weight than it seems. Let's start with where this all began. In July 2023, the Wall Street Journal's, or WSJ's, editorial board published an opinion piece in which it accused Canada of the same crime. The article suggested in a mocking tone that Canada's attendance at the 2023 annual NATO summit should have seen the country sit at the junior table due to how feeble its commitment to military spending was. Canada's commitment of 1.38% of its gross domestic product, or GDP, to defense simply wasn't enough, the WSJ argued. Worse yet, Canada's membership in the group of 7 nations was called into question, with the WSJ noting that it's the lowest military spender of the 7. Canada has long been a free rider off the US military, which it knows stands guard over North America, the article claimed, while suggesting that Canada has spent several decades living off being a founding member of NATO and an important ally during World War II. But if sovereignty and national pride mean anything, Canada can't afford to float above the fray on defense. President Trump seems to agree. And though he's not willing to send the US military in to show Canada what the supposed free riding achieves in a war, he's committed to using economic force to make Ottawa see his point of view. Almost from the moment Trump became president, he started threatening Canada with tariffs on its exports. He followed through on that threat in early February, imposing a 25% tariff while claiming that what essentially amounts to a tax on Canadian goods is due to a combination of concerns over illegal immigration and drug trafficking. In other words, Canada's military isn't solving these issues, so the US will implement tariffs until they do. Canada responded with 25% tariffs of its own, affecting around $106.6 billion of American goods. On February 4th, Trump paused the American tariffs for 30 days after receiving assurances from Canada that it would ramp up its border patrols to deal with the immigration and trafficking problems. That temporary pause came in the wake of Canada committing to boost its border enforcement, which will tackle at least one of Trump's concerns about the country. Canada will deploy 10,000 soldiers to its US border to combat fentanyl trafficking. However, that seems like a strange goal for Canada to have, when less than 1% of the 4,500 pounds of this illicit drug seized in the US since September 2024 originated in Canada. The vast majority, a staggering 98%, was intercepted at America's southwest border with Mexico. To that end, Mexico has also committed 10,000 troops to its border for similar reasons as Canada, with that border force likely to be far more effective in slowing down the fentanyl flow. Regardless, Trump was quick to praise Canada's approach in a social media post where he announced the tariff pause. "I'm very pleased with this initial outcome, and the tariffs announced on Saturday will be paused for 30 days to see whether or not a final economic deal with Canada can be structured. Fairness for all," wrote Trump. Canada also committed to creating a joint strike force with the US to fight drug trading, organized crime, and money laundering in Canada, along with agreeing to designate the Mexican cartels responsible for much of North America's drug trade as terrorist groups. This is all well and good. However, none of these actions seem to solve the biggest problem Trump seems to have with Canada. Extra border troops do nothing to prevent Trump from calling Canada a free rider that's riding the coattails of the US military to peace and prosperity. So the possibility of tariffs being re-implemented still exists after the 30-day pause if Canada doesn't do something to address the defense spending problems that Trump highlights. But does Canada need to do that? This question leads to another. Is President Trump and the WSJ right to call Canada a free rider? To answer that, we first need to put the free rider claims into some context. It all comes down to the 2014 NATO Wales Defence Investment Pledge, or DIP. Under the DIP, all NATO members are asked to aim to spend 2% of their GDP on defence. That was followed by the 2023 NATO Vilnius Pledge, which made the 2% commitment more watertight and essentially tried to obligate all NATO members to meet it rather than merely suggesting that they should. You may remember from the Washington Post piece that Canada fell well below that spending guideline in 2023, hitting just 1.38% of its GDP in defense spending. It wasn't much better in the decade before 2023. In fact, there was only one other year when the country matched or exceeded its 2023 GDP expenditure, hitting 1.4% in 2021. For most of the period between 2012 and 2022, Canada hovered around the 1.1 to 1.3% mark for GDP expenditure, though it managed to fall below even 1.01% in 2014, when it spent just 0.99% of its GDP on its military. Contrast this to the United States and you start to realize where Trump is coming from with his free rider comments. The US has consistently spent well above 2% of its GDP on defense since NATO was founded. 1953, which was the height of the Korean War, saw it raise spending to 11.3% of GDP. We saw similar spikes during other American conflicts, such as the rise to 4.5% spending in 2010 during the height of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. But even when you take wars out of the equation, the US consistently spent over 6% of its GDP up until the 1970s and has hovered around the 3 to 5% mark since the 1990s. The most recent figures we have are for 2023, when the US spent 3.4% of its GDP on defense, still 1.4% higher than the NATO recommendation. And with 2024 bringing with it a further 2.7% increase in American defense spending, it's clear the US will have exceeded the NATO target once again. We start to see a pattern emerging. For well over a decade, Canada has fallen short of its commitment to at least try to spend 2% of its GDP on defense. In some years, it spent less than half of that. The US, on the other hand, has consistently spent more than double the GDP target since the 1950s and is still almost doubling it today. The disparity is thrown into an even larger contrast when you compare the actual dollar amounts. America's request for its 2024 defense budget was $842 billion. That money would go towards supporting the 1.3 million people in its active military, along with all the equipment purchases needed to keep the US at the top of the global military heap. Canada's defense spending is tiny in comparison. The country's Office of the Parliamentary Budget Officer, or PBO, says that Canada is likely to spend $39 billion on its military in the 2024-25 period, with that figure rising to $52.2 billion by 2029 to 2030. That's less than 5% of what the US spends on its defense, and it gets even worse. These figures are in Canadian dollars. They become $27.32 billion and $36.57 billion respectively when converted into American dollars, demonstrating an even larger gulf between what the US and Canada spend. Canada has even committed to reducing some of its defense spending, though this is done in the name of efficiency and focused on the National Defense Department. That department is aiming to spend $810.4 million Canadian dollars less in 2024 to 25, though Canada could at least argue that's money saved that could be spent on equipment. It's all adding up to a confirmation of Trump's claims. Canada definitely spends much less than the US on defense, lending credence to the idea that the country is free-riding and expects the US to come to its aid if it's ever attacked. On the plus side for Canada, the country is trying to improve its GDP expenditure. In July 2024, outgoing Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced plans to boost Canada's defense spending to 2% of its GDP by 2032. That would be more cause for concern for Trump. Having to wait almost a decade for Canada to reach its NATO spending target would only add more credibility to his claim that the country is free-riding. Canada's Defense Minister Bill Blair realizes that, which is why he made the media rounds on January 24th with a claim that reaching 2% GDP expenditure was actually achievable by 27, 5 years earlier than Trudeau's target. "My goal is to do that as quickly as possible, and I'm increasingly confident we'll be able to," Blair told CBC News. It's no coincidence that these latest claims come in the wake of Trump saying that Canada should become the 51st US state. Blair is trying to make the case that Canada is not only on the path to 2%, but is going to accelerate its journey along that path to keep the US happy. But there are problems with Blair's comments. Back in October 2024, the PBO pointed out that Trudeau's original plan to hit 2% of GDP on defense spending by 2032 would face some obstacles. For Canada to achieve that, it would need to double its current defense spending by that year. That would run Canada's spending straight into the brick wall of a set of fiscal anchors the country's parliament put in place in 2023 designed to control expenditure, such as the proposed budget cuts by its National Defense Department we mentioned earlier. Those fiscal anchors are designed to reduce Canada's debt to GDP ratio, with the goal being for the country to maintain that ratio at the 1% mark by the time it hits 2027. They were put in place because Trudeau's government came under intense criticism for failing to rein in government spending in 2023, and they now put Canada in a tough spot. Either the anchors need to go to facilitate the increase in Canada's defense spending to 2% of GDP, or they stay in place and make those increases practically impossible. The PBO also believes that Canada won't hit the targets Trudeau set, never mind the accelerated target created by Blair. It says the projection for Canada's defense spending to reach 1.76% of GDP by 2029 to 30 was unrealistic, with the actual ratio likely to be 1.58% of GDP. The increase requires a rapid escalation in expenditures, PBO claimed, while adding that the Canadian government hadn't explained how it was going to increase defense spending with the fiscal anchors in place. The message seems to be simple. Canada can claim that it's going to push up to 2% of GDP spending on defense, but right now, the numbers don't add up. and that fact will only lend more fuel to the free-riding fire. Still, you might think that Canada isn't the only NATO nation that isn't hitting the 2% target. There are plenty more, so maybe the country's spending situation isn't quite as bad as it looks. If you had said that before Russian President Vladimir Putin started his special military operation in Ukraine, you might have had a case. But that war seems to have woken up many NATO members to the need to spend more on defense, resulting in Canada being one of only a select few that aren't hitting the 2% target. That's according to the Atlantic Council, which says that the Ukraine war has prompted an 18% increase in all defense spending among NATO allies across Europe and Canada up to July 2024. Those increases have led to NATO as a whole reaching spending of 2.71% of GDP when every member is taken into account. But individually, Canada falls well short of GDP spending when compared to most other members. As of 2024, 23 of NATO's 32 members meet or exceed the 2% target. That puts Canada in the company of just 9 that are failing to spend as much as NATO suggests they should. To make matters worse, Canada isn't even the highest spender of those 9 that aren't hitting the 2% mark. Italy, Croatia, and Portugal are all spending more of their GDP, even if they're still not spending as much as NATO wants. Only Belgium, Spain, Luxembourg, and Slovenia are spending less than Canada on the GDP front. So Canada isn't just being massively outpaced by the United States when it comes to military spending. It's also in the bottom 5 of NATO's members for spending related to GDP, again making it seem like the country is free-riding. And it gets worse for Canada's case to not be called a free rider. CBC News also points out that NATO members are expected to spend at least 20% of the money they dedicate to defense on military equipment. That condition was outlined in the 2023 NATO Vilnius Pledge we mentioned earlier, and it's a condition that Canada isn't meeting. Worse yet, it was one of only 2 NATO members that failed to hit this 20% equipment spend mark in 2024, which is problematic given that about half of the country's existing military equipment is either unavailable or unserviceable. In other words, Canada has not only underinvested for decades, but its attitude has actively weakened its military on the equipment front. The situation is so bad for Canada that ex-Trump administration official Elbridge Colby says that Canada is making a mockery of its status as a Group of 7 or G7 nation. How can it slot into that group when it mocks the bare minimum of what's required going into a G7 summit, Elbridge asks. However, perhaps the most obvious sign that Canada is a free rider that's relying on the US to come to its rescue lies in a comparison between the two countries' militaries. According to military aggregator Global Firepower, the US has 1.328 million active personnel in its military. Canada has just 68,000. Canada only has 351 aircraft compared to America's 13,043, and its Navy has 367 fewer assets, coming in at 73 vessels. A shocking statistic considering Canada's 151,019-mile coastline is the longest in the world. No matter where you look, Canada seems to fall short. It has 74 tanks compared to America's 4,640. The US has over 391,000 armored vehicles, while Canada only has 21,704. Canada has no artillery and no mobile rocket projectors. There's not a single aspect of the country's military that comes close to the United States. Of course, it's not expected to. Canada's GDP was $2.89 trillion in 2023 compared to America's $27.72 trillion, meaning it would be spending far less on its military, even if it hit the NATO targets. But the disparity between the two countries is so massive that many, including Trump, could feasibly argue that Canada wouldn't be able to defend itself without the US if it was ever invaded. The case is incredibly strong for Canada being considered a free rider. But what about the case against this claim? It's not as convincing as Canada would like. Canada could point toward NATO's 2% target as being a suggestion rather than a requirement and highlight that it has a multi-year plan to reach that target. Neither argument holds up especially well when you consider how many other NATO nations hit 2% and the barriers in the way of Canada's own plans to do so. A more convincing argument for Canada would be that it's one of the more active NATO members in terms of its participation in the organization's operations. That's the case put forth in a July 2023 piece by Benjamin Zeiler for the CDA Institute. He states that Canada is among several countries that perhaps focus more on soldier deployment in NATO operations than they do on the amount of money the country inputs into the group. This measure not only includes an analysis of the outcome of a particular operation and member states' contributions, but also its sustainability, for example, in a peacekeeping mission, Zeiler argues. He brings up the example of Bosnia. Canada was involved in NATO missions in that country during the 1990s, with Zeiler pointing to the long-lasting peace that resulted, as proof that Canada isn't a free rider. Sure, it spends less of its GDP on defense than most other members, but it's more active in operations that achieve NATO's goals, meaning its output outweighs that of many other nations. Perhaps Zeiler has a point. The problem is that Trump, the WSJ, and everyone else who accused Canada of being a free rider isn't going to look too intently at these operations. And even if they do, they can point to similar US involvement and how those operations wouldn't be possible at all were it not for the countries that are spending as much as NATO recommends on equipment. Zeiler also makes the case that the US thinks globally, with most of its defense budget going toward America-centric activities, whereas most other NATO nations think locally, often in European terms. But again, that won't help Canada. It's part of North America, and the US can argue that it should be as concerned about the defense of that continent as the US. Right now, it doesn't seem to be, at least to Trump. And those numbers and statistics don't exactly play in Canada's favor. Perhaps the Great White North truly is a free rider. If it is, what do you think Canada can do about this problem? Is it possible for the country to increase defense spending to 2% of its GDP rapidly, or are the barriers it has in place going to stop that from happening? Will Trump continue using tariffs to get what he wants from Canada? Share your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out What If Trump Uses Force to Take Over Canada, or click this other video instead.